I first started playing Magic the Gathering in 1999, but like most of us, I've drifted in and out of the hobby over the years, and I've abandoned my entire collection a handful of times. I thought I was content to just draft digital cards on Arena for the rest of my life, but then I got invited to play Commander. So I picked up a Precon, and after just one game night, I was fully hooked. The Precon was good for learning the format, but I've always been a deck builder at heart, and a win just doesn't feel as good to me if it doesn't come from my own deck. So of course, I started brewing, and as of right now, I have 37 deck lists of varying degrees of completion. I'll come up with an idea that sounds fun, sketch something out online, and then sit on it for a while before deciding if I actually want to build it out. Now, unfortunately, the shoebox full of cards that used to live under my bed is long gone. All the fetch lands, the unplayed Rhystic Studies, the Steely Resolve that I used to run in my favorite elf deck, even the counter spells, the Lightning Bolts, the Llanowar Elves, all gone, either in a shoebox under someone else's bed or more likely in a landfill in the middle of the California desert. I have 0 cardboard to my name, and I'm starting from scratch, so that means if I want to build a deck out, it's time to start spending. I usually order from TCG Player because it's usually the cheapest option, and I'm a cheap person. Okay, what I mean is I like having something to optimize against when I'm deck building, and budget is a really easy choice. As a kid, I couldn't play the strongest decks because I couldn't afford them. I had to make the best of the cards that I had, and honestly, I kind of prefer it that way. I'd get pretty bored if my deck was full of the obvious choices, the format-defining staples, the predictable must-plays. It just wouldn't feel like my own deck list if I was running all those cards. So, to make things a little more interesting and challenging in the deck building process, I try to keep my list as close to $100 as possible. So I built out a group hug deck list that would cost about $107 on TCG Player. Once I actually got the list into TCG Player though, the total jumped up to $166.44. Some of the cheaper printings weren't available, so I had to go for more expensive ones. And some of the cards were out of stock on Direct, so I would have had to pay extra shipping to get them from individual stores. And paying $5 shipping on a 1-cent card is just not something I'm ever gonna do. So, if I wanted to get this deck in hand, I had to find another solution. And luckily, I live right here next to possibly one of the best resources in the entire country for buying Magic the Gathering cards, Frankenson Collectible Show. So I'm gonna head in here and see if I can find all the pieces for my deck in one place, in one day. Wish me luck. Frankenson is a massive collectibles store, essentially an entire convention hall filled with individual vendors selling everything from video games to comics to trading cards. I'm here to see if I can build this deck in one day for cheaper than TCG Player, so I headed straight to the Magic vendors to start browsing. Right away, I was shocked at the sheer number of cards in front of me. I've only been into card shops a handful of times in the past decade, and none of them really came close to the massive inventory some of these vendors were carrying. Display cases were filled edge to edge with the most sought-after cards in the game, and not just a couple copies of each. I mean, this is basically an entire limited deck's worth of Sheoldred, and Sorin, and Vilis, and Sidisi, and Dictates, and Whips, and Tutors, and damn, that's a whole Commander deck, and then some. Behind the counters there were boxes and boxes of cards that didn't make it to the displays, and it wasn't just singles. You could get a pack of just about any set you want. It brought me right back to my childhood, seeing those boxes of Odyssey and Torment and Nemesis up there together. It was honestly a bit overwhelming at first, just seeing so many cards and not knowing where to start, but once I settled in, I figured I'd just hand my deck list to a vendor and see what they had. I wrote out my entire list and started cramping about halfway through. I handed off the list and kept wandering, just checking out some of the retro games booths while I waited. Once my cards were ready, I headed back to pick them up. After just one vendor, I already had about 80% of the cards I was looking for. Before heading to another booth though, I took a second to look things over. Okay, look, I'm going through my list and I'm thinking, I'm kind of like under budget right now. Should I add some of the more expensive cards from the considering pile? Since we're here and it's easy, Adam says yes. I might just throw some on this list, just to have them, just in case. Right? I ended up adding a few of the more expensive cards, and by that I mean like over $10, to the list before taking it to the next vendor. So I ended up finding all but 5 of the cards that I need, and the second shop that I went to actually went around to all the other shops to check if they had it. I guess no one here has those 5 cards. To be fair, it was a Wednesday, and there were a handful of vendors that just weren't open that day. I recently went back on a Saturday with another list of cards that were out of stock on TCG Player. There were more shops open that day, and I managed to find all of the cards that I needed. Overall though, I got almost everything, and I have enough stuff already at home to make up for these that are missing until I can find them, but that's not bad. For one day, hand over the list and get an entire deck back. And it ended up being cheaper than TCG Player too. Remember, that entire cart would have cost me $166.44, or $147.64 without all the extra shipping charges. At Frank's, I spent a grand total of $123.41. Yeah, it's a bit more expensive than the $100 I was originally aiming for, but it ended up being cheaper than ordering online, and you really can't beat having the entire deck in hand in less than an hour. It is a dangerous superpower for someone who has 36 more deck lists waiting in the wings. Alright, if you've made it this far, I'm sure you want to see the deck, so here it is. This has been my most fun deck to play, and it's also won me the most games in my short Commander career. So here's the deck laid out into basically its main categories of cards, and we'll go through them one by one, starting with, of course, the Commander. It's a group hug deck, and the idea is everyone draws cards. You can see the Howling Mine already. The Commander is the second Doctor. Players have no maximum hand size, which is important, and then at the beginning of my end step, each player can draw a card. Each opponent who does can't attack you or permanents you control during their next turn. So essentially, try to bribe people with cards, and then they can't attack you for a little while. That doesn't really work out that well, because people will just stop taking the card once they have a big board state to attack you with, but it enables a second draw each turn, which is the most important thing for me. As a Doctor's Companion, I have Ryan Sinclair. It's literally just there so I can play red in the deck. I think I've cast this card once when I desperately needed a body on board. Since the main idea of the deck is everyone draws cards, here are all the cards that make everyone draw cards. So there's a handful of Howling Mine style cards that just make everyone draw an extra card on the draw step. Howling Mine, Kami the Crescent Moon, Dictator Crewfix, Fevered Visions, it's on your end step, and you take 2 damage if you have more than 4 cards in hand, which is nice. Scrawling Crawler, everyone draws on my upkeep, but whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 1 life. So then after that, there's even more cards that let everyone draw a card as an activated ability. So I'm deciding when we do it. Temple Bell, Otherworld Atlas, Quain, Dakra Mystic, a couple land versions of it, Folio of Fancies, Lore Broker, Lauren, which doubles as a removal spell. And then there's a few more everyone draws cards, but like different. Forced Fruition, I love this. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player draws 7 cards. That really speeds the game up. Sometimes if someone's popping off, they'll draw out their entire deck. Socrates is a fun one. It's kind of a protection spell also. It basically prevents combat damage and lets you and the creature's controller both draw cards, so it can kind of neutralize a big attacker. You could use this when someone's attacking an opponent to make them both draw cards. And then the last one is Swins of Bryn Argyle, it's kind of a weird one. If damage would be prevented to it, instead the source's controller draws that many cards. It's a great blocker. If someone's attacking with something big, I can block and make them draw like 10, 15 cards, depending how big their creature is. But it also has some fun interactions with other cards in the deck that we'll get to in a second. So those are all the everyone draws cards. The next category is I benefit from drawing. These are all cards that reward me for drawing cards. Emrakul's Messenger is basically a ramp spell. Whenever I draw my second card, I make an Eldrazi spawn. Homunculus Horde is a new one. I love it. Whenever I draw my second card, make a copy of it. It gets out of hand very quickly. Chasm Skulker, whenever I draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, I make a bunch of tokens, and a lot of these are going to make tokens. So Alondra Sky Dreamer is one of the best win conditions in the deck, actually. Whenever I draw my second card, she makes a Drake. Whenever I draw my 5th card, she and all Drakes I control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. I just won with this the other day, where I attacked with a bunch of 18/18 Drakes for lethal damage on all 3 of my opponents. Min Wily Illusionist is another one that makes tokens when I draw my second card. They're illusion tokens that get +1/+0 for each other illusion. When they die, I can put a permanent onto the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the illusion's power. This is great because sometimes it can cheat out big enchantments like Forced Fruition, or if the illusions are small, I can just put an extra land into play, which is great because I'm drawing so many cards, I'm gonna have a lot of extra lands in hand. Ironcrag Pyromancer doesn't make tokens, but it just basically dishes out a lightning bolt whenever I draw my second card. So since I'm drawing so many cards, it's kind of just free incidental removal on anything with toughness 3 or less. Zerzoth is a fun one. It's a little different. It's whenever an opponent draws their first card, if it's not their turn, I make a devil token. So that's why controlling when we draw a card is important, because if I use Temple Bell on my turn, I make 3 devil tokens because all 3 of my opponents drew a card and it's none of their turn. And then the last payoff in this category is a little bit different. It's Heliod the Radiant Dawn. When you flip them, this is the important side, you may cast spells as though they had flash and they cost 1 less for each card your opponents have drawn this turn. It's pretty easy to make my opponents draw a bunch of cards, and that makes all my spells cheaper, and I can cast them whenever I feel like it. If Heliod comes down and stays on the table, I am casting like 4 or 5 spells on your turn. Guaranteed. Okay, so we all draw extra cards. I benefit from drawing my second card, and this next category is gonna help me draw my second card each turn. It's pretty easy to do on my own turn. That's gonna happen no matter what if I have my commander out. But then I have a few cards that help me draw on opponents' turns. Smuggler's Share lets me draw a card if an opponent has drawn 2 or more cards, so on their turn, if I have Howling Mine out, on their end step, I'm drawing a card for sure. Mungara the Diplomat does something similar if an opponent attacks me with 2 or more creatures, or if they cast their second spell, I draw a card. The Council of 4, I draw a card. When you draw your second card, I make a token too, which happens pretty often, and that's nice to have. Okay, these next 2, look, these weren't in the original deck list. These are the 2 most expensive cards in the deck. Fairy Mastermind, I think it's like $18. Trouble in Pairs, it's like $25. But I make an exception for these because I got them cheap. I got good deals on these. I think I picked up this Fairy Mastermind in Japan for less than $10. Good deal. Whenever an opponent draws their second card, I draw a card. Great enabler for that. Trouble in Pairs, someone in my playgroup posted a crazy Amazon deal where the entire precon that this came in cost less than this card alone. So I got this card plus an entire deck for the cost of this card. Look, basically it does the same thing. I get to draw a card whenever my opponents do things on their turn, and that's valuable. And then I have Teferi's Ageless Insight, which essentially just doubles all my card draws. So if I have one of these out and it's letting me draw a card on an opponent's turn, this will turn that into 2 cards, and that 2 cards will trigger any of these cards that care about that. Okay, next up is the Ramp package. It's basically all mana rocks, all the ones you know and love. Little no maximum hand size for redundancy. The only 3 mana rocks are Misleading Signpost, which is just a fun interaction spell, and Sonic Screwdriver, which has a bunch of utility that I like. Making something unblockable is pretty good as a win con, just to get in that final bit of damage. And untapping another artifact is very important. I also have Unwinding Clock, which untaps all my artifacts during each other player's untap step, meaning all of these get untapped every turn. And that's also going to untap Temple Bell, it's going to untap Otherworld Atlas, so I can use them multiple times in each turn rotation. That gets especially out of control with Otherworld Atlas, because in 1 turn rotation, if I'm untapping it, I can get 4 charge counters on it, and from then on, we're all drawing 4 cards each time I activate it. I've also got a handful of artifact lands to go along with the mana rocks, because when all of these are getting untapped every turn, that leaves me a lot of mana up for interaction, which is the next package. Now originally I was running the predictable stuff, Swords to Plowshares, Path of Exile. You can't beat the rate of those cards, but I decided to replace them with cards that would help the theme. So they're not as powerful, Into the Royal, Geistwave, they're just bounce spells, but they can also draw me a card. So if I'm playing this on an opponent's turn, that's gonna help me draw a card, and you know, I like to draw my second card every turn. I'm only running 1 board wipe, but I wanted it to be a fun one, Promise of Loyalty. Everyone gets to keep a creature, but they can't attack me with them. It's a group hug deck, you know? I can't be totally mean about things. After that, I'm running 6 different counter spells because everyone's drawing so many cards, they're gonna have all their best cards. I need to have answers. So all of the counter spells, almost all the counter spells, will also draw me a card. Divide by 0, it's a bounce or a counter spell, basically. It lets me learn so I can draw a card. Arcane Denial, it's a counterspell. I draw a card, you draw cards. We all love that. Artistic Refusal, it's expensive, but if I'm making a bunch of tokens with like Alondra or Homunculus Horde or Emrakul's Messenger, I'll have a lot of tokens on board to convoke this. I can counter a spell and draw 2 cards. Interdict is fun, counter an activated ability and draw a card. That's great against like Beamtown bullies. Reverse the Polarity, it can be a counterspell. It can also be a finisher because it'll make all my creatures unblockable, and if I have a bunch of tokens on board, well, they're all getting in for damage. And then Narset's Reversal, it doesn't draw me a card, but I mean, it's just fun. It's fun to turn someone's big spell against them. And that's kind of what a lot of the rest of this interaction does. I run a lot of interaction in this deck because we're drawing so many cards. I'm gonna have a lot of this in hand. It's fun to just have the right random card for any situation that comes up. So Wrong Turn, that's a fun one. It just gives someone's creature to another player. It's great if someone's behind and you want to kind of help them stay in the game, catch up. It also can interrupt someone's strategy if they need one of their creatures. Just give it to someone else, let them have fun with it. Island Sanctuary is kind of a stacks piece. It's protection, it's a little redundancy because late in the game, people are going to stop taking the card from the doctor. But since I'm drawing so many cards every turn, it's not going to cost me much to skip one of those draws and prevent creatures from attacking me. If I skip a draw during my draw step, only creatures with flying and island walk can attack me. So good protection. Mystic Reflection is a really fun card. The next time one or more creatures or planeswalkers enter the battlefield this turn, they enter as copies of a target creature. This is amazing against the last March of the Ents. You can't counter it, but I can make everything you put down enter as a copy of a random 1/1 token on the battlefield. It's also great when Chasm Skulker dies. If this had 10 counters on it, all 10 of my 1/1 squids are now entering as copies of your best creature. And speaking of copies, I love Mirror Weave. This might be one of my favorite cards in the deck. Each other creature becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature until end of turn. Someone wants to remove my Scrawling Crawler because they're about to draw a bunch of cards and they don't want to lose a life. Well, Mirror Weave, now every creature on the battlefield is a Scrawling Crawler, and if you draw one card, you're losing 20 life. I'm sure there are an infinite number of situations where this card is going to be fun. It can also serve as a win condition. When I have a bunch of tokens on the field from any of these that are making tokens, I can just turn them all into copies of my opponent's biggest creature and have like a bunch of 10/10s on my board. Reigns of Power is fun. Just trade all your creatures with your opponent's creatures. It's good if like I don't have my token makers out and someone else has a big board. That can be a fun win condition. Then we have Fractured Identity. Exile target non-land permanent. Each player other than its controller creates a token that's a copy of it. You can exile someone's best creature and then everyone else gets a copy of it. Or my favorite way to use this is to exile my own Forced Fruition so all my opponents get a copy of it. And then whenever someone casts a spell, they're drawing 14 cards. Of course, I'm drawing 21, so if it gets back to me, I could deck myself out, but maybe I should add like a Laboratory Maniac to my deck, just in case. Comeuppance is a fun one. Basically just redirect all the damage that would be hitting me to my opponent or the creatures that are attacking me. And finally, Gideon's Sacrifice. Choose a creature or planeswalker I control. All damage that would be dealt to me this turn and permanents I control is dealt to that permanent instead. It's a great 1 mana, save your life, and if someone's making an Alpha Strike and I redirect all that damage to Swans of Bryn Argyle, then the 60 damage you were just pointing at me turns into you drawing 60 cards and you probably just decked yourself out. This is such a fun combo to pull off. All right, the final category here, and really the reason I'm playing red in this deck, are the hard win cons. These are cards that are just going to kill you because you have a lot of cards in your hand. Remember, the commander says players have no maximum hand size. We're all going to be drawing cards. Everyone's going to have a full grip. And then there's these cards. So, Emberwild Captain. Basically, if I'm the Monarch, when you attack me, you take damage equal to the number of cards in your hand. And if you've got 20 cards in hand and 15 life left, well, you can't attack me until you remove this. I actually like that this is obvious. People know if this is on board, they have to deal with it, or they can't attack me, or let's say they have 20 life left and 10 cards in hand. You have to make the choice. Is it worth taking the 10 damage to attack? By this point, they're probably not taking the free card from the doctor, so they want to attack me, but here's a little insurance. If you attack, it's gonna hurt. Unquenchable Fury is one of my win cons for sure. It's an aura that says enchanted creature has whenever this creature attacks, it deals damage to defending player equal to the number of cards in their hand. If you have 20 cards in hand and I attack you, you're taking 20 damage. And it's just on attack. The creature just has to attack. It doesn't even have to get through for damage. And Whenever it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return it to your hand. So you can kill the creature, but if this hits the graveyard, I'm getting it right back. The next one is Runeflare Trap. It costs 6, but it really doesn't. It costs 1, because an opponent is definitely drawing 3 or more cards when I'm playing this. Runeflare Trap deals damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. When I have Forced Fruition on the battlefield and someone's popping off and casting 5 spells, they've drawn 35 cards that turn. I cast this for 1 mana, and they're dead. And then finally, Sword of War and Peace. It's basically the same thing as Unquenchable Fury. When equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, Sword of War and Peace deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand, and I gain 1 life for each card in my hand. So early in the game, it's nice to just add a little bit of extra life, do a little bit of extra damage, but once we're late in the game, this is a serious win condition. Last but not least, the mana base it's pretty standard. I mean, I have a lot of basics, I have a lot of cheap dual lands. You know, this is a $100 deck list, or $123.41 deck list. The only interesting lands, I guess, are Terrain Generator and Horizon of Progress. Both of these let me put a land into play from my hand, and that's just nice when I'm drawing a bunch of extra cards. If I have mana up at the end of an opponent's turn, I can just put an extra land down for some ramp. Other than that, pretty standard mana base. So there you go, my favorite Commander deck that I've built, and I built it in 1 day at Frank & Sons. If you want to see more of Frank & Sons, I have a video right here where I just go and look at all the retro games I could find there. And I have a cool project that I'm working on for my Commander deck box, so that video will be up soon. If it's up, you can click on it right here. Thanks for watching. Maybe we'll get some games in sometime. I'll see you soon. Bye.